Recording in progress.
I call to order the Roseville City Council meeting for Monday, July 10th, 2023. Mr. City Manager, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Strawn. Councilmember Etten. Here. Councilmember Schroeder.
Here.
Councilmember Groff. Here. Mayor Rowe.
Here. And Councilmember Strawn indicated that she was under the weather this evening and not able to be here, so we certainly wish her to feel better soon. And I will make a couple of introductions also at the start of the meeting here. We have our City Attorney, Rachel Tierney, on my right at the end of the dais, and our City Manager, Pat Trudgeon, on the opposite end of the dais, and a number of staff and other folks from the city who will participate and guests and will be introduced as agenda items come up. I would note for members of the public, there is a copy of, or maybe multiple copies of tonight's agenda on the back table under the big clock if you need to see what the agenda is or know when things are coming up. We also have a copy of the meeting materials, a complete set of the meeting materials for members of the public to reference if need be over the course of the meeting. We would remind folks to silence your phone or otherwise assure that it doesn't disrupt the meeting as we proceed this evening. And I understand that we have a few participants signed up to participate remotely.
Yes, we do, but nobody's on at this
Nobody's
point.
on at this time, so my instructions to them will be meaningless until they're actually on. All right, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. With that, we'll ask folks to stand if you're able for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, next on tonight's agenda is approval of the agenda this evening. I'll check, as I always do, first with staff to see if there are any changes that need to be made from a staff perspective this evening.
Mr. Mayor, we do not have any changes to the agenda.
All right, and I'll check with council members. Council members, any items to remove from consent for separate consideration or other changes to the agenda this evening? All right, hearing none, I'll do a quick check with members of the public. We do want to always check at the beginning of the meeting about items in section 10, which starts at the bottom of the first page of our agenda and continues on to the second page. Those items, A through H, are normally taken up as a single motion at the end of the meeting with a limited opportunity for discussion or input because they're usually fairly administrative in nature, and so we don't necessarily handle those as typical business items. But we always do want to check at the start of the meeting if somebody is here to either ask a question or make a comment about one of those items in section 10, once again, items 10A through H. This would be a chance to let us know, and we can remove that item from the end of the meeting, move it forward earlier in the meeting, and take it up at a more convenient time for members of the public who may wish to participate. Is there anyone from the public here this evening who wishes to ask a question or make a comment about an item in section 10 of tonight's agenda? And I'll double check with the city manager to see if anybody's come online yet.
No one has.
No one has, okay. With that, then it sounds like we've got our agenda. Is there a motion from the council to approve tonight's agenda as presented?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder, seconded by Councilmember Groff. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 4-0. We have our agenda this evening. Next on the agenda is general public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak on items that are not on this evening's agenda, but may be of interest to people in the city or related to city business in some fashion, other than, once again, being related to an item on tonight's agenda. We will provide an opportunity for public comment on agenda items as they come up. So look forward to that opportunity, but we also do want to provide this general opportunity. And just the rules of the road for people is we do allow a 10-minute, oof, I just got generous, a 3-minute time limit for each speaker. I will try to enforce it gently. We do ask speakers to start their comments with their name and either their address or street for the record. Address comments and questions to the city council, and then if there's any follow-up that needs to happen, I will sort of coordinate that with staff. But feel free to come on up, and once again, welcome for public comment. And just to be sure, folks, if you're here for for an agenda item later, we will have an opportunity for public comment then as well.
Thanks.
And there's no limit. If you speak on one item, you can certainly speak on another item too.
In
Welcome.
3 minutes. Thanks,
Yes.
Mayor Rowe. I understand that you've discussed as a council, or perhaps it was Public Works, Environment, and Transportation Commission, the idea of making takeout containers be, either absolutely recyclable or compostable or, just be generally friendlier to the environment. And I have, I brought today the
Actually, if
climate.
you could introduce yourself first. so
Oh,
that we
I
know
beg
who-
your pardon.
And I should note that we will provide an opportunity for public comment on that agenda item this evening.
Oh, you will?
So
Okay.
you can either speak now because we've come up to the table,
Okay.
or if you'd like to speak then, but
I'll just speak now briefly,
Okay,
if you don't
sure.
mind.
No,
It's
that's fine.
Allison Jensen. I live on Eldridge Avenue between Hamlin and Lexington.
Good to see
here
you
in-
again.
Yeah, good to see you. I just, because I understood that takeout containers were going to be discussed but not necessarily voted on today,
Mm-hmm.
I just brought some information from the Climate Action Handbook, which is a very helpful thing put together by a school of public health professor here at the University of Minnesota, and it's relatively new, and it's just very empirical and full of facts. So, looking at takeout containers, and if you would like copies of this, what is the carbon cost of a takeout container? And I don't know about you guys, but our household goes out about twice a week, so, it adds up. And for the nation, the 7.5 billion clamshells we use, used to call them styrofoam, represents 297 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. So as somebody concerned about the climate, I would like us to consider that. And we've done some great stuff, So I think that's.
thank you. And if you wanted to leave copies of that with the city manager to give to
Okay.
the council, we'd be happy to accept those if you
Okay.
brought copies to share.
Thank you, I did.
Thank you again for your comments this evening. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to speak on non-agenda items this evening? Right, and did we have anybody yet from the public?
No.
Or from the online? No.
You're not.
All right, then, if we're done with public comment, then we'll go ahead and proceed with the rest of our agenda, which gets us right into a topic related to the previous comments. There we go. There we go. And that is a joint meeting with our Public Works, Environment, and Transportation Commission. And so I'll ask the members to come on up and grab a seat, grab a chair, I should say, so that you can have a seat at the table. And we may have to kind of distribute the mics a little differently at the table once we get everybody seated.
Yeah, we have those.
So we might be able to get by with just the two mics we have, it looks like, with 4 members. So for those in the booth, nope, you could have left it exactly where it was.
Go back.
Do not touch.
There we go. Two wrongs make a right. All right, thank you, unless you have an introduction,
No,
we'll just
feel
go
free
right
to
in.
jump
All
right in.
Thank you for having us today, we're happy to be here. My name is Bryant Fisek, I'm the chair of the commission. I let my members introduce themselves.
Ed Hodder?
Allison Luongo.
Desiree Mueller.
All right, in your packet, we had a bunch of items. And first thing, just wanted to reflect on what we've done over the past year. We highlighted a few items. First one was our less mow May, as we call it now, instead of no mow. So trying to change the vernacular a little bit. We reviewed that with staff, helped set direction, and I thought made it more visible this year. We had the signs out. There were a few on my block. I could see it in the surrounding area. So from my perspective at least, I thought that was a very good collaboration, very good way to move forward on that one. Sustainability is wrapped in throughout most of our meetings, but every January, we've turned this into an annual sustainability meeting, or super meeting as we call it. So we had our 3rd annual one, and we talked about zero waste events, how we're doing in terms of 2040 goals, how we're moving forward on that, EV charging, just it ends up being a bunch of different topics, which is great to inform us, and then we can inform the public as well. So fabulous meeting every year. We had an update on transit, where it was, how COVID affected it, how there's been reduction in service, but then how they're looking to move forward, particularly with I'm forgetting the name of it, some of their new initiatives. They've got the Transit Now.
Network Now.
Network Now, thank you. That's why they're here. They can correct me. But new initiatives like that, along with G-Line, how it might affect the city, and then how they're trying to move forward and how to recapture people, as well as just make the best use of what we have. Microtransit was a term that I hadn't heard before, so it was interesting to learn a little bit more about that and how that could become, how that could be a part of things moving forward. And they're in some test cases right now, pilot projects, so interesting to learn about. And then every month too, we just have our staff updates, and definitely just getting an update on where they are in the construction plan, different initiatives moving forward, different developments, and anything affecting public works, transportation, environment. So hitting all that stuff. And I'll just take this moment just to say thank you to the staff. They do a fantastic job of preparing for every meeting, helping us get prepared, and even with a little bit of a transition there, as we had one member of the staff leave and other people come in, I think they've just done a fabulous job. So I can't thank them enough on that. Anything you would like to add in terms of activities or?
Just on the transit and Met Council, they're also involved in their 2050 plan. And so cities and counties are providing input in that process. And we are also aware of what's transpiring on that issue. I actually represent our agency on the 2050 plan, so that's kind of, it's a nice dovetail with what cities are doing also.
So then moving into what we're looking forward to and what we want to hit to next year, we have a few items that we know we're going to get to or we'd like to get to, and then some questions related to those items. Speed limits is one area that we've talked about. What should they be on local roads? How could they, well, pros and cons. What does that look like? We've met on that a few times, and this needs to be a broader conversation than just our commission. So one of the questions on here, and we can get to that discussion in a little bit, is just how would you advise us to move forward with the public? What should we move forward with engagement with staff, making public meetings, going to different events? Just assuming we move forward on that, what would you like to see to make sure we're gathering that communication input from a wider view of the public, rather than, we represent our areas, but should be more than us up here talking about it. We have the directive from the council on our scope, making sure we look at everything there, and we did provide some information. We had a recommendation on what we thought our purpose should be, and we'll bring that back because we want to look at that a little bit deeper. Once we had that conversation with you, Mayor, we decided we needed to come back and think about, do we have the right number of members? Are we meeting the correct amount of times? Go back to our scope. Did we capture everything correctly there? So anything can be on the table, and just want to open that up again beyond what we've already done. We'd like to look at the establishing a bike network, a specific plan for that. There are elements throughout other plans within the city, but it would be helpful if we had just a separate document to talk about bikes and the biking network, and that would help us coordinate with other agencies and make sure we're developing the best network we can. Our recycling contract is coming up, and we'll be talking about that and seeing what that means in terms of how we move forward there. With the information coming forward on transit that we talked about earlier, we'll bring them back again. That'd be interesting to see an update as they start to implement some of their ideas. And then one we brought up recently from a member, just would like to work more with the Finance Commission on our future road maintenance. I don't think this one was listed in your packet, but just what does that financing look like? What for the future maintenance, and how do we stay on top of that? And I think that's a great opportunity for some joint collaboration between our commissions. So I'll ask again, did I miss anything in terms of the initial work plan before we get to questions and discussion?
I guess the only thing I would add is we talked a little bit about a collaboration with the Finance Commission too, looking at the sewage and lateral lines. I think that is something that we
We talked,
discussed.
yeah, we discussed that at one of our meetings, and we haven't really explored that further at the moment, but that could be an option as well.
We certainly have information in the packet about that topic that was put forward as part of this conversation. So certainly, hopefully we're prepared to provide some input on that.
Fantastic. So then I guess I will pause there and just, are there any initial questions, comments, thoughts on what we've just presented, or we can move into our discussion portion and start talking about the questions as we look forward?
Any general thoughts, comments, questions? Councilmember Grau?
General thoughts is I am very impressed with the work you're doing. I mean, I watch it in bits and pieces when you do it, but when you put it all in one document, it's like, wow, this is really impressive. So I liked your discussions. I liked looking at both sides of an issue, you know, the pros and the cons, like you said, Sheriff Fleesick. And I appreciated the detail in the report. It was helpful for me.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ratten?
I would also note the amount of work you've done is excellent, and there's a lot of people thinking in different ways, and I think that's what we ask you to do. So thank you for doing that work. I think the only piece here that might matter going forward that's not in our later queue up is the bike network plan. I think that's a great idea to be thinking, how do we make that a cohesive system that we do that connects to our surrounding systems.
I kind of presumed that because you didn't have a specific question on that topic, you were just going to do it anyway, regardless of what we said. So,
Probably.
but
We were going
good
rogue
to
on
know
that one. We thought we might slip that one by. You caught us.
All right. Sounds like maybe we can dive into the discussion topics then.
All right, great. Well, then the first one we have on there is speeds. And like I talked about earlier, just mainly looking for some guidance on how you would like us to move forward, particularly with that engagement piece, and how do we bring this, assuming we move forward on it, how do we bring that to the wider public and get other views beyond what we have already discussed?
Well, I think there's probably the two threshold questions for the council is, do we move forward further on this topic? And certainly it's something the council initiated to get conversation going, and then certainly feedback on, you know, what we look at in terms of engagement and things like that. So I'll kind of open it up for the council members for the feedback on sort of the first step as, you know, do we continue to look at this this topic and this process going forward? So, Councilmember Grau.
I liked your discussion on that, where you were looking at what other cities surrounding us have been doing and how that's playing out in their areas. So I thought that was helpful information. It's probably not complete yet, was the way I felt from reading the report anyway. There's going to be more information coming in, especially on how policing works with the change in speed limits, things like that. So I think it's an ongoing thing, but I am not convinced that I don't know how far we should proceed right now.
Other thoughts from council members? Councilmember Shorter.
Thank you for being here tonight. I always look forward to meeting with commissions. Being on a commission myself, I've been on that side of the table as well, so thank you. On the speed limit, and I just have a few questions. You know, I wasn't around for all the conversations that the council had with you. What is it, what we're trying to solve with this? Is my first question is, you know, what is the purpose of doing this? Maybe I'll just give you a couple of my questions. And then the enforcement issue, I noticed you had said in your minutes that you wanted to talk to the police about it, and I'm curious if you did, and what was the feedback on that piece of it? And then if you could also, what is the, you know, benefits versus the cost side of that? And did you, other cities, when they lowered it, did that reduce the speeders, or how, I mean, I'm just kind of curious what the other cities actually ended up, did it help them solve the problem they're trying to do? And what is the, I mean, the one piece I'm assuming has to do with crashes or some sort of accidents, and what is Roseville's percentage of, I saw you in the presentation you had Minnesota, but I was just curious, how does Roseville stack up to that? So I guess if I go all the way back, What is it we're trying to solve with this first? Maybe that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, so this came up, we had, initially with the council, we had that conversation of whether we should look at it, what does that mean to look at it? And part of the reasoning behind it was simply the risk factors. If you look at the risks in terms of being a bicyclist or pedestrian, and you are on the road, we don't have sidewalks on our local roads, so if you're on the road and you get hit by a vehicle, your chances of survival increase with lower speeds. So getting hit at 30 miles an hour is vastly different than getting hit at 20 miles an hour. There's a risk there. So that was, at least to my view, part of the reason to start looking at it and saying, is this something we should do? You had a lot of questions there. I'm going to try to remember them all now.
Okay, no,
In terms
And
of
we don't
talking.
have to have the answers this
Right,
evening.
right.
Yeah.
But I do want to have the conversation, at least provide some of that background, because I know you weren't there before.
Were there a lot of accidents? Do we have a lot of accidents?
And
in
that's
Roseville?
what, looking at it, there's not a tremendous amount of accidents. So there are some, but no, it's not something, at least from my recollection of the graphs, not something that somebody could point at and say, oh my God, what's going on? So you're really looking at a risk. You're also looking at priorities. If I'm just focusing on what could be the pro side, you're looking at that risk and you're looking at the priorities. Are you prioritizing walking? Are you prioritizing biking? How does that mix into our sustainability and climate? So those are all the factors that can come into it. In terms of talking to the police, that is a conversation we still need to have. They provided us some of the information, like with the crashes and that, but in terms of, what would that mean for their day-to-day if a change were to come forward, something yet to be explored. And then in terms of what other cities have seen, I don't know that there's been a definitive view. Some streets have gotten better, others have not. I'm still kind of waiting for St. Paul and Minneapolis to provide that after one. They were the first ones to do it, so what has their experience been? There are some studies, if I then look at the opposite side, that have said it's really street width. The changing of the sign doesn't matter. It's what's the environment that you're driving through. And for the streets that we have, they're pretty wide open if nobody's parking on them. And so it leads to that. And then back to your enforcement too. Are we going to turn everybody, because they're reacting to their environment, are we turning them now all into speeders? So lots of questions in answer to your questions, which is why I think this is still an interesting topic to move forward. I don't know that I'm convinced one way or the other. I'm trying to keep an open mind as what it could be. And we talked about different ways how it could move forward for the city. Do we go to a 20 mile an hour? Is there a mix of collector versus local? And it changes based on what the environment is. Should it only be 25? Or back to our base of, we're okay, we can just leave it as is. So still lots of questions to move forward, and that's where we are at. Having gotten that information, we're now looking at it and going, there's still more we can explore. There's still more viewpoints we can gather. Should we do that, and how should we do that?
Thank you.
Councilman Bratton.
Thank you. And thanks for the work you've done so far. I read your minutes, but kind of felt like I needed to watch all three meetings because of the presentation. I didn't have time to do that. So I think we have a partial piece of information here. That's part of my thing. First of all, I'm skeptical, but before we move forward with anything, I think the council needs to see that kind of information and level of presentation before we talk about going to the public for viewpoints, to see if the council is ready to take that jump. I think you've listed off some of the pros and cons very well. Councilmember Schroeder brought up one of my questions is how many speed-related pedestrian and bicycle accidents we have on city streets in Roseville. My understanding is very, very few. There are many other reasons. I had the opportunity to listen to a Freakonomics podcast yesterday on this very issue, because we're all geeks like that, I guess. There are more pedestrian and bicycle accidents really resulting in fatalities right now, but it goes everywhere from the number of SUVs on the road, which hit people at a higher level, to how the roads are built and COVID factors of speeding. And so there's so many pieces to that, where the actual street speed is a small potential factor. Understanding that getting hit at 30 miles an hour is definitely more impactful literally than 20, right? So those kinds of things make me slow down. Even our tree-lined streets help to slow traffic, right? So there are all these things. What are we doing? It almost gets to some of your purpose you talk about later. What are we doing with our streetscapes and our street designs to help slow things down? When I look at St. Paul or Minneapolis going to 20 is plenty. I've driven a lot of their roads, and I do it all the time, and I don't see any big change except on streets where there were a lot of cars on one or two sides of the street, and then it was already slower, right? I mean, you can't go 30 on those if you design to keep yourself and anyone safe, right? So I don't know that that data is going to tell us much, but if New Brighton did study, then I would be able to say, hey, here's a more relevant connection. In your presentation, we did have the slides from the last meeting in April that you had on this, and there was new local research thing, LRRB, guidelines for determining speed limits on municipal roadways. First quote coming out of that from the staff pulled out of that report, changing the speed limit alone had no effect on driver behavior. So I would rather see what effects are we having on the current driver behavior before we change everything and then say, hey, now we have a double thing to deal with. So I am skeptical. I will not say no, but I am very skeptical about moving forward because of all those pieces. Additionally, one of the reasons to do this would be to connect with our neighboring municipalities. We've got some at 20, some at 25, and some at 30. So who are we connecting to? Right? And most of our connections are on county roads. So, for me, I just keep coming back to, I'm not sure of that question, what are we solving? I'm not sure that we are solving much, but I think we're going to do a lot of work. And I'm concerned that that would take work away from other things that are really important. And you listed some other really important things.
So I do want to weigh in too. I'm probably the most pro changing of the speed limit, but only for the residential streets, the sort of the lowest level streets in our system. I'm not looking to change. We can't even necessarily do it. Change speeds on county roads and things like that.
Right.
And certainly even on city-owned streets that are filling more of a connector role or a collector role, I understand that those probably don't necessarily need to be the ones that we look at on lowering speeds. But I think, to me, right now we don't do a lot to enforce speeds on our lowest level residential streets anyway, and I'm not suggesting that we change that from an enforcement point of view. I think the huge part of this is the education aspect of it, the notion of how much safer it is for an individual to be a pedestrian or a biker on a street, in sharing the street with pedestrian or with vehicles, when speeds are just generally lower. And I think that I'm not sure that we can only educate and not change the speed limit. I'm not sure that we could just change the speed limit and not do any education, but I think there may be a way to do it hand in hand. And just anecdotally, we were meeting with mayors and city managers from some of our neighboring communities this afternoon, and they said that their speed limit didn't drastically change things, but I think they felt it was part of a process of moving towards people being a little more conscientious when they're driving on their residential streets in terms of the safety of pedestrians and bikers. And if the expectation is that you drive 20 or 25 or whatever the speed limit is, then that makes it easier to educate people, because if you tell everybody your default speed limit is 30 on any street that isn't posted, and then you tell everybody how much safer it is to drive 20 or 25, they're going to say, yeah, but we can drive 30. There's no. So I think it needs to be, if we're going to do it, and I agree that there still needs to be some more discussion about it. It needs to be two pieces. We need to do the change to the limit, but also the education part of it. I absolutely do not think we should be changing the speed limits on any other streets necessarily that are posted. I know several posted streets that hopefully will get slower through other changes, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think our unposted streets, I think we might want to set a lower expectation for people and then work to move people in that direction. But I don't expect that overnight there's going to be a wand waved and everything is going to be magically different either. Because we can't necessarily say statistically we're going to cut accidents in half if we have one accident on average a year or something like that, it's not something to necessarily point to, and I don't want to spend a lot of time looking at it. But I think the question is, if we do it, do we think we can get benefit from the educational part of it, and how does that look? And so I think I want to know more about that as we look to go forward. I'm not so concerned about how much we spend on enforcement, because I'm not envisioning that to change very much, and some of those other factors. So, but I do want to understand how it can have an impact if it's coupled with that educational aspect. So that's my feedback, and certainly other council members can rebut or add comments. Councilmember Schwartz.
I would agree with Councilmember Etten that I would not go to the public on this at this point, because it's, that there's just too many unanswered questions on this, and I think that would be confusing for people. So if we went out to the public and then we didn't do anything, or if we, and so I think we want to make sure, again, back to my original question, what is it we're trying to solve, and make sure we're very, we know what that is and what we're trying to do before we go to the public on things. So I also think there's so many other great things you guys need to work on and are working on, that there's only so much resources, and it's the priority piece that you talked about, right?
Absolutely.
I think there's some other things that we could get more bang for the buck for you guys to spend your time on. It doesn't hurt to continue to be educated and look to see what people are doing, but some of these other items, I would prefer to see you spend your time on than this one.
Councilmember Grau.
I would just add in that if it's your child who's hit on a bike, it doesn't matter if it's not statistically a big number. That is a very life-changing thing to people. So as Mayor Rose said, the residential streets are really the ones where that probably is the most I just anecdotally on my block, we've had a family move in down the street, and those little kids love to ride their bikes down the driveway, and quite often they're out in the street. Now, people who live there know that, so we all slow down when we get there. But if you had someone coming for dinner or something and they weren't aware of it, because of the curve in that street, it can be pretty dangerous. And I think, as you said, the impact at 20 versus 30 is substantial when it's a person on a bike or not not in another vehicle. So I think it warrants more research, is what I'm saying. I'm not ready to jump out there either, but I don't think it's something we should let just go away, because we have other things to look at.
And I'll just add, I didn't weigh in on the engagement of the public part of it. I definitely agree that we should know what we're doing before we start going out, for input from the public necessarily. So I think it would be helpful to understand sort of that, some more of these questions, answers to those, and then probably have another conversation or two to figure out where we want to go from here.
Great, thank you. I'm going to skip a little bit from the order in the packet, because I think it matches in the ideal street design. We had that on there as something we could talk about, which is obviously related to speeds, as we just noted. Should we be looking at that and try to determine what, as streets and roads come up for reconstruction or maintenance or whatever, should we be looking at what is our ideal, and can we move towards that? So that would be, you want to call it a subset, but something of a topic in its own right, definitely.
All right, I see Councilman Bratton has his hand up.
I think this actually ties to another item you skipped over there, is when we talk about public safety as related to transportation infrastructure. All of these really tie together in some way. And I would certainly be open to that. I would wonder, what I wondered today and didn't get a chance to ask this question is, for example, on the roads where we're using municipal state aid dollars, are we stuck with a certain street width and things like that, or is that something we can play with? And that's certainly how we rebuild a lot of roads, certainly our collector roads. And thinking about that, but I'm open, because that is a thing that has been shown that reduces speed limits without other mitigating things like police cars sitting there with a speed gun, right? So I think that is something that is literally something concrete we could potentially do.
So,
Oh, I meant all of that.
other thoughts for council members? Councilmember Groff?
I'm very open to having some research done on it. I would be very careful about changing some things, because I've seen some of the things they've done in Minneapolis and what a disaster that was for snow removal. I mean, the streets got down to being almost nothing because of those curb out. So I think it's worth looking into, but I'd like to see the details.
And it's probably a thing where there may have to be sort of different standards for different purposed streets, because we want to make sure that we're not applying sort of just a one-size-fits-all, one road-size-fits-all solution. And then it gets into, I was thinking about, maybe we could, as we're reconstructing a road, we could figure out whether residents on that road feel that they need parking, and maybe we can reduce the width of the road and make no parking on one side, for instance, and help with some of those calming factors of a narrower street. And then, of course, what happens is 10 years or whatever down the road, there's a whole new set of people living there that are at City Hall complaining about not having enough parking on their street. And so it's not an easy question to answer either, but I think, we have some standards, and I know, as we've been going through things, we hear about the complete streets and things like that. And I think it just becomes a question of how we apply some of that to our standards in our own requirements for roads, both for as we're reconstructing our own streets, but as new, subdivisions might go in and they're putting in a street and things like that. Certainly worth looking at. I don't know that it's the highest, that you want to spend, more time on that than maybe some other things, but at the same time, I think it's important to somehow fit it in. Any other thoughts on that? So it seems like something we want to, continue to be looking at. Councilmember Schroeder.
Yeah, and it actually fits into a number of pieces. Again, I'd want to make sure that, what is it that we are required to do is really important, and I think the mayor made some good points, is what's fashionable today may not be fashionable tomorrow. And so I guess I'm not sure what this would look like, but I think some conversations around it is fine. The one part that I wanted to ask you was, and Council Member Etten pulled it together with the public safety. What do you mean by that? I mean, how do you envision that piece of it?
So that's something that we had in our scope recommendation as well. And what we were thinking of is just, could be lots of things, but it could be a review of crashes, just general. Where are the hot spots? What are we doing about it? How does that mix in with our roads versus county roads? Just making sure we're doing that. It could be talking to the police every so often, just going back to, again, where are their hot spots? Drag racing on Snelling, what is being done about it? Talking about different initiatives like that. It could be talking to the fire. What are their routes as they're moving through? Are there any issues that they're seeing as they're just as they're trying to make their way to emergencies? Are there things like that we should be looking at? So I think it can go any number of different ways, and it was more just a setting of, this seems like a relevant topic that really hasn't been explored, and so those were just initial thoughts that of where it could go. It's not an intention to talk about how officers or the fire do their job, just more of what issues are they seeing that could impact what we talk about in terms of either sustainability or the infrastructure, and how might we work with them to solve those issues.
Well, thank you, because that's where I was trying to figure out which direction this was going on. And if you're looking at, I like the idea when you talked about which routes they go for, the emergencies, or if there's a hot spot, is there a way to redesign the road in that area to make it, so I can see where that could intersect very well. And I think, looking more from that aspect versus, you're right, you don't want to get into trying to tell police.
No, that is definitely not in our area.
Okay.
So that's
Thank
why
you.
we definitely want to say public safety as it relates to
Perfect.
infrastructure.
And that makes sense especially if you're looking at design, because I guess that, that would, you'd want to consider that aspect of it when you're doing design. So thank you.
Yeah, the last thing we want to do is have road widths that can't fit our fire apparatus or something like that. Yeah. No, I think I would concur that makes sense to be looking at that.
Well-
And I appreciate you kind of elaborating on the standards too, because I know that was a question from Councilmember Strawn. She had, and just relayed in some of her thoughts for this evening, is that she would want to know more about what that is. And so it does help to have that understanding. And certainly I think, we should at least be asking the question, are our current standards what they should be going forward, and where is it appropriate, if it is appropriate, to make some changes to those standards? So I think it does make sense, and certainly the public safety aspect of it and other aspects tie in for sure. So, and I didn't mean to cut off.
Oh, no, I was just going to cite a good example of that in action. It's just near the high school in B2, where it was designed in such a way that it's very safe, with the turn signal and the way they redesigned the street intersections there. It's much easier for the students and vehicles to get across safely. And that's a good example of where it was done very well.
Is that on Lexington and B2?
Yes.
In the recent project?
The recent project.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Yes.
All right.
We kind of blended a couple there, but were there any other thoughts on the public safety that we need to?
I think it does tie to pedestrians once again too, and the thing that comes to mind is the study that's going to be done at Snelling and B.
Yes.
Working with the county. I think that's something that will be of great interest to the folks on the commission. I know it'll be of great interest to us and people in the community as well.
All right, then going back to where we left off, we had organized waste collection, organized garbage collection on there. There is I think it's from 2021, I don't know if it was an ordinance or directive, but basically said don't touch it. None of us were here at that time. If that's the directive, that's fine, but it's come up a couple times in our commission, and we just wanted to bring it out and say, should we be thinking about this, or should we just leave it off and can be handled some other time?
I'll maybe start and say that certainly I think one of the things that the council looked at the last time that this topic was discussed by the council, and it was essentially, should we take it up again? It had been taken up fairly recently and was brought back for another chance to consider by the council, and I think the council at that time in 21 or whatever it was had said that it doesn't seem to be something that's sort of a ripe issue in the community, and that was actually almost a quote from our survey provider at the time we did our last community survey, which was, you've got a fairly substantial chunk of people that are either supported or are strongly supportive of it, a fairly substantial chunk of people that are either oppose it or are strongly opposed to it. There's not a real strong consensus or a sense of a middle, and so the feeling was that sounds like it's not a ripe issue at that time. I will say we haven't had a survey done probably since that one.
Correct.
And so I don't know that we know exactly where the public is, but I would say from my perspective, I'm not sure I want to initiate a conversation about that topic until we maybe get some input from the community. And it's always, I know it can be a kind of a which comes first thing. You could educate people more about it, and then you might get different answers on a survey, but I would at least like to take a temperature from my perspective as to kind of where the community is, if it's any different than it was a few years ago. But I'll certainly defer to other council members to provide some thoughts as well. Councilmember Brad?
When we looked at it in 21, we were kind of in the middle of the COVID disaster, and it was going to be a hard time to reach out anything different from our survey. And the survey actually showed a dramatic reduction in support for organized hauling at that time, which is something that gave me pause. And the addition of the waste facility that is shared with Washington County and Ramsey County significantly improves what's happening to our waste and pulling out things out of the waste stream. So for me, those things haven't changed. I haven't seen any big thing that's different from that, so I wouldn't be ready to jump into this again at this point.
Other council thoughts, feedback? Councilmember Groff?
Well, I brought it up last time, and I don't think it was in 2021 when that survey was done. What was the year on that last
It
survey?
was done that spring, late winter, early spring
And how
of
many
21.
responses did we have?
It was whatever, 400 or 500, whatever.
Full complement, yeah.
Whatever.
Which is a
Survey
typical
is.
survey.
Yeah.
So that was the response. But no, it was not a easy lift, so I don't think you have the votes up here to do it.
Great. Any other council feedback? All right. It would
Okay,
seem at this time anyway that until we get more information about where people are at,
fair enough.
we're not going to bring.
Like I said, none of us were here at that point.
Sure.
Sure.
Well, and I would just note, that was something else that came up in our conversation with other mayors and city managers. There are a couple other suburban Ramsey County communities that are at various stages of looking at this, and so it might be worth kind of tuning into where they're at and what's going on in their processes, and that may help us, also be informed about it, and maybe we'll know more from depending on how our residents have followed the issue, both in St. Paul and in those other communities, who knows how that's going to inform public opinion. So we'll hopefully be able to do another survey in the not-too-distant future, and that will no doubt be a question on the survey.
Another item we've discussed is, the way we put it in your packet, is regulating small motor vehicles. We were specifically thinking of scooters. Again, if I go back to your question of is there a problem to solve, I don't know that there is one. So it's kind of that question of, do we look at it and prepare for it, or do we wait and see if it becomes a problem? Because I haven't seen an explosion of their use here that it has happened in other areas, so I don't know if this is really an issue or not.
Thoughts from Councilmember?
I watched one of my neighbors taking my daughter to the Oval here, going down on a motorized scooter on Victoria. There's no one else around, and so it didn't seem like it was a big deal, right? And he was moving without a car, so he was saving fuel, and I'm just not worried about it.
Other thoughts from council members?
I haven't seen any issues or heard anything.
We were kind of thinking about like the ones that are taxpayer subsidized in St. Paul or whatever, like the ones where you could like rent and cruise around. I think, isn't that
was part of it.
Yeah.
That was,
That
thank
was
you for
just
the
one of
clarification.
the specifics of what we were talking about, are those ones.
Or the ones
Not-
that may or may not be municipally supported, but
Yeah.
also are private entities, where
Yeah,
it's
we're
not your
just,
own
people
personal
leave them
scooter.
everywhere
Right.
and
Yeah.
after the bar, hop on one
Right.
and that kind of stuff.
Councilmember Schroeder?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, because I had a question here, because when I'm out walking, which I do a lot, usually the motorized small vehicles I see are people who are disabled using the park, so that's where I wanted to make sure that we weren't gonna try to regulate people that were disabled trying to use our parks, and that's the only way they can get around.
Mobility scooters, yeah.
Yes, on that piece, so thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I don't know, I think it's kind of early in the adoption of those business models, it seems like, as to whether, it doesn't seem like we're getting a lot of them in Roseville, and to the extent they're left here, they seem to be picked up by the people who own them and gotten back into where they're supposed to be. So until there's more of an issue, I'm not sure that that's something we need to look at. And I know Councilmember Strawn had said in her notes that was not something she was necessarily in favor of taking a look at this time.
all right, thank you for that. Moving on, we had the mowing ordinance. So as we looked at our Less Mow May, we did take a peek at the ordinance and tried to get into the background of it. And as far as we can tell, there really isn't. Somebody just picked 8 inches and said no higher than that, and that's been what it's at for however long. So thought that might be a good opportunity for us to look at that, particularly in different ways that you might handle a yard. Are you allowed to have a longer area and some, a patch that might grow longer where you're still maintaining the rest of it, whether, mowing a good portion of it so that you're showing that you're taking care of it, but you have specific areas? Could there be variation like that? So that, again, that can go a lot of different ways, but just thought of, since we do have the less mow, should we take it a step further and look at our mowing ordinance and see, are there ways to change it and make it better, base it on something else, and try to react more, again, in that sustainability piece of how people care for their yards.
Thoughts from council members? Councilmember Ash?
Just jumping in every time, you're sorry.
And I'm purposely not trying to call on you.
You're purposely looking away from me?
No, I just want to make sure I'm
Okay.
Being even-handed here.
I'll just keep going. I think that we have provisions for natural areas, grassy areas, or certainly BMPs and things that are already there, and that the continued support of those and encouragement of those, either through our own ordinances or through support from our watershed districts and things like that, is something that we should continue to look for ways to grow. I didn't mean that that time. But I'm not sure I would want someone to just say, I'm not going to mow this grass. There's a difference between having prairie grass, like we have out here, that's intentionally that, versus just saying, you know what, I'm not going to mow this 20 by 20 section of my yard. Those are two different choices for me, so I wouldn't be prepared to say, I'm just going to let that go to weed or just whatever, versus looking for ways to encourage more native plantings and things like that that might, we have certainly several people in our community who have essentially gotten rid of their grass lawn and moved to many more native plants and things like that, and I think that's fantastic, so that would be my thought.
All right. Any other thoughts, Councilmember?
Well, just to piggyback on that, and that's already allowed under the ordinance,
Yeah.
so I don't know what the.
Or maybe the ordinance isn't explicit about that.
Maybe
We need
not.
to make
Well,
sure that it is.
It's definitely two different parts of our code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One is in Chapter 4, which is our nuisance, well, 407, I think it is, which is our nuisance area, and that talks about being able to maintain native plantings, you know, and once again, I think it's pretty explicit there that it says you can't just let, you know, turf grasses grow and weeds and whatever else might be there. You have to do an intentional native type planting. But you do otherwise have to maintain coverage on your lot. You can't just let it be dirt, for instance, because there's a whole host of reasons you don't want to do that.
Right.
But it may make sense to look at our mowing ordinance and have a better understanding, and that may be in Chapter 4 also, I'm not sure, but just that it's clear that for any non-native, for anything that's not an intentional native planting, which is allowed under our ordinances, you do need to do that maintenance. And the primary reason actually for the mowing at 8 inches in that case is that it's primarily for the prevention of the spread of noxious weeds and things like that. That's not so much that it's a magic height, you know, for this is good-looking grass, this is not good-looking grass. It's more specifically to deal with the weeds and those sorts of things, as I understand it, as the weed inspector.
As the weed
said.
inspector.
I forgot about
So,
that.
Expertly said.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you,
yes,
thank you. So I think that's really what that's getting at, is the notion of not just having overgrown, you know, anything, and including all those types of noxious weeds that we don't want in our community. So that's primarily what the purpose of that is. But at the same time, it is good to note that we do, you know, offer the opportunity to do native plantings and encourage it. And to the extent our code language may not quite jive correctly between those two areas, we may want to make some adjustments. Councilmember Schroeder.
You know, and I do think we have changed and updated some of our code with the native planting, and that's fairly recent too. So some of those changes, I think you're correct, Mayor, that they may not all jive. So I don't have a problem with you taking a look at it and seeing if everything is meshing. That might be the important part versus should it be this many inches versus that many inches. I think it's more on making sure that the what we can, you know, either you can mow it or not, or you have to have these specific plants, maybe take a look to see if that's all worded correctly and that it makes sense. So, yeah, I would be okay with that.
Councilmember.
And I would piggyback on that. It's good to have eyes look at these things because you, like you said, you haven't all been here for a long time, and when you read it, you'll probably find things that don't make sense, and just because we've seen it 100 times doesn't mean it makes sense to
Yes.
people that are just trying to figure out what to do with their lawn if they want to do native plantings. So I think it would be helpful.
What I also take away from that is potentially more education as we go into less mow May.
Yes.
And making sure we're looking at both and saying, if you go this route, you can do this. If you go the other way, you can do that.
Another
And making sure
opportunity,
people
yeah.
know their options, yeah.
Maybe there's less mow lifestyle is the other piece of it.
There's your marketing background. I like it.
Pending.
All right, before we move into some of the recommendations that we had from our past year, we just had a last open one. Are there any other topics that we haven't touched on so far that you feel we should?
Council? It's hard to imagine, given
I'm impressed.
everything you have been touching on.
Do you really want more?
Well, we are reviewing our scope and everything, maybe we need to meet more often, but no, we want to make sure that we are reflective of what the council wants, and if there are priorities, definitely we should reflect that. So we are
That's why we
working for your
put,
benefit.
Duties as assigned in the bottom of that.
Right.
Councilmember Etten?
This is almost tongue-in-cheek. Your signs probably need to add like a BMP on the other side from the dump truck or something like that, as you look at changing your scope, and I think in great ways, but just a dump truck on there, I don't know. Mr. Fryham.
And your name tags right there.
Yeah,
Oh, on the
right
name
there.
badges here on the table.
Right there.
They have done-
Right?
Native plants, yeah, that's a big one.
I don't know.
Spend some time designing that.
I don't know that we'll be able to do public works without dump trucks, though.
I don't think get rid of it.
Oh,
It's the other side.
just update the signs, okay.
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
And for folks following at home who don't know, BMP stands for Best Management Practice related to stormwater.
Water retention
Yes,
ponds.
yes, exactly. I think we could probably jump into the other topics.
So the last one we wanted to get to, just recommendations that we had over the past year, and just mainly have some conversation back and forth if there were any questions or anything we needed to go further on. We had the takeout containers in there. Our recommendation was based on St. Louis Park and what they did, using that as a base. So they had called it a green to go. But it was basically following that to ban the polystyrene and plastic number 6 in the food takeout containers. So I think I'll leave it there, and just was our recommendation to the council, and just wanted to follow up, see if there was any conversation needed.
All right, and does this tie in also with the single-use plastic bags as well, or did you not have a recommendation in that area?
That one, I'm trying to remember back, I don't think we had the recommendation for that one. I think it was solely focused on the takeout containers right now.
Gotcha. All right, I appreciate that, because in my mind, I kind of put the two of them together, but I'm not sure that they
I think we
belong
separated, yeah, we separated those two.
Okay.
I'm gonna look back for guidance.
Nope, well, it's over here.
I don't think we did any kind of recommendations for
Thank you.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Councilmember
just,
Etten?
I appreciate that you've stayed after this, and I think you've done a great job with it. I brought this up before the pandemic and then said, let's pause in the middle of the pandemic. But I think we're at a point, several of our cities in the Twin Cities and certainly around the country have shown that there are supplies available and ways to tackle this. And I think the recommendations I saw here and some of the information from staff show that we have a tailored approach that you're suggesting that is not trying to change everything right away, but trying to make some specific moves on some of the plastics that can't really be recycled or things like that, and thinking about how we implement. So I think it's a really good plan overall that we should move forward with.
Okay, other thoughts? Councilmember Schroeder?
I do think it's a good project to work on. I want to make sure that we're working closely with businesses, the restaurants on this. Especially, I know some of them are still suffering a bit from the pandemic and the hangover from that, I guess. And so we want to make sure that as we move forward with these things, that we get their input. I think it's doable, because I do believe there's been a number of restaurants in our city that are already doing this.
Even in Roseville, yes,
And
right away.
so I think those would be really good ones to reach out to make sure, to see how they did it and make sure it's, and I'm sure, maybe someone has already done that, but that would be a really important step in that. Because we want to make our community welcoming, and a lot of the restaurants are the smaller businesses, and we want to make sure we can still do the sustainability and make sure our businesses can still do well. I think it's an and, not an or.
Councilmember Groff?
Yeah, I would agree with that. As you said, there's an educational component, and bringing this in over a period of months or maybe even a year and a half or something was really wise, in my opinion. Reaching out to the businesses is important, but it has been done other places, so there may be a piece of that that is educational for them, that yes, there are these resources that can do this. So I thought your work was very good on this, and I would support it.
Councilman Bratton?
Sorry, I just remembered, I don't know, I'm sure our staff is aware of it, but as we move forward, if we move into that education piece, making sure that our businesses, these businesses that would be impacted, know about the biz recycling program that Ramsey County does. It's a tremendous deal with free supplies and systems to be put in place to take care of their waste stream. That might be an important tie-in piece to help them with the transition also.
Yeah, I was glad you noted that. I think that to the extent that we can provide sort of those resources, whether it's, connecting businesses to existing resources that can help with those kinds of advisory roles, to the extent we may want to look at some kind of small financial assistance to help with transition, maybe something we may want to talk about as part of that implementation. I'm not saying I want to do it, but I think we should at least put that on the table as something to think about, especially with those small businesses. But absolutely that piece about getting people connected to those resources, because I have an understanding that biz recycling in Ramsey County is underutilized.
Yes.
And definitely has a lot more potential for uptake from our business community. And not just specifically in this topic area, but in a whole host of ways that businesses generate waste and how those streams can be handled. So I think this may be a way to get into businesses and get them aware of other aspects of how they can be working with things, including food waste. Right, anything else on this one? And I would just say, I think we need to continue probably thinking about the bag side of it, but there may be more issues that we need to understand with that. And certainly other people are trying different solutions, and knowing how those go helps too. Councilmember Brown.
I would agree with that, especially after reading they have to jackhammer those bags off of the equipment and the recycling. I was surprised at that. I'd never heard that before, and I think Commissioner Wozniak mentioned that, and he's very knowledgeable on that.
Yes. And once again, I think it's great that a number of our retail entities collect the bags for recycling, and certainly I try to avail myself of that as much as possible, but it just seems like there's a lot of bags out there, and so
Yeah.
it's a problem that needs more work.
All right, we discussed speed limits already. We can move forward. Same thing with the scope change. Got those items on there. So then we move to our sewer service lateral revolving loan policy. So this is one we talked about earlier, and just when the services need to be replaced, revised, if there would be a way to help those residents out. And revolving loan was one way to do that. That could help then provide that financial assistance as needed. And it was our recommendation to explore that. Thought it would be a good item for the Financial Commission to look at as well, and just think about how that could be moved forward.
All right, council thoughts, inputs, Councilmember Groff?
Well, coming from real estate background, this is a big topic, of course. Most buyers now have a sewer scope when they purchase, because it is such a large ticket item. And it can cost, I've seen costs as high as $15,000. And if you're a first-time buyer, that's not something you're prepared for. So I think it's a good topic to research. I don't know what the answer is. I think revolving loans, I'd look at that as one possibility. I don't have the other answers, so I'd be interested in what you come up with.
Councilman Bratton?
I checked with our EDA staff, our economic development staff, and we have several loan programs in place through the EDA that can be used for this purpose already. So the city actually has in place loan programs that people can use for lining we lined our sewer lateral maybe 5 years ago, whatever. And yes, it's expensive, but we do have city loan programs in place that can help families with that.
So it may be an education situation.
Education piece,
I'm
yes.
not sure all
Yeah.
of us were aware of that necessarily. Now, the other thing is
So,
that sometimes.
very good idea.
Yeah, oh,
Right.
yeah.
So, yeah.
We seem to kind of already be doing it. The other thing that comes up occasionally is
knows
there
about
are entities that do like a warranty program for your sewer connection. If I remember, we've seen that occasionally where the city can endorse it or be involved in some way. And I know the council hasn't really been too terribly interested in that in the past, but I just at least wanted to make you guys aware of it on the commission, that if that topic comes up, you know, we're kind of aware of it, and it may merit discussion, but it already has had some council discussion with, and granted, there's been turnover on the council too, so, and programs may change, but I know those are out there too, and those, they advertise, you know, out there in the community as well, so. Councilor Schroeder.
I would say if you need to do, visit with some of the EDA staff, just for an education standpoint, to see what that program's about and how it works. I mean, if that's something you want to, and again, it's important that the commission understands, and I think that's part of the scope, understanding different parts of what you're working on. So, I think that would be okay if you wanted just for an education standpoint, find out what that program's about and maybe see that it's covering what you were thinking.
Okay, thank you. Last one we had on there, street name policy. This is one we just talked about last month. It came up specifically for County Road B, which is no longer the county road.
West of Cleveland.
West, thank you, West Cleveland.
Yeah, we don't want to have people too confused.
Yeah, West, yeah, not the.
We've taken it
Road B.
over, guys.
Yes, that's right. I don't think we want that one.
No, sir.
So west of Cleveland, we talked about that. If it's no longer a county road, it doesn't connect to 280 anymore. That's been a long time. Should it really remain County Road B? And so staff brought forward a policy that could be enacted that would allow for that name change based on discussion with the residents, and we thought that was a good idea.
Thoughts from the council, Councilmember Groff?
Since that's the road I go up and down a few times. I do know from neighbors that that is of interest to them. So I think, as you put in your report, there's a process to reach out and do some education and find out if, people support it in that area, and then proceed from there. I think they have to fill out, do you have a form or something they sign?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it would be wise because, it isn't a county road anymore. It doesn't, there's so many trucks that turn there thinking it's a county road still. And then they find out when they get down that street that no, it's not, and then they're trying to turn around in those little areas, so.
Yep.
B plus.
Other thoughts, Councilmember Schroeder?
I do like the idea that you went beyond just this one issue.
Exactly.
To look at a policy on how this should be done, and I do like the idea that you had some parameters around that as well. I do like the idea of having a policy and then also having the residents be the one to partition for it, so I do like that.
And I will just deflect a little bit, most of that to staff. I mean, they were the ones who provided this for us, so, again.
You should just
nice
take the
shout out.
credit.
Want to give credit where it's due, so.
I heard it was Des. How long have you been on the council?
Yeah, right.
Great initiative.
Yes.
Councilmember Adams.
I'm okay with this. I'm not sure it's going to solve the problem that it's stated. I think that GPS doesn't care what the name of the road is. It's still connecting, right? And that's what most people are following. They're driving using a GPS system that's directing them in the wrong direction. So I'm okay with this. One of the things that talks about here is bring this with 50% of area things, but with a name already selected. And I would be concerned about how the name was selected and how that process works. Thinking about our process for naming parks, for example, that we may be skipping a humongous step in how we would arrive at a name, what would be an acceptable name for a city road. And there are a few things here, like you can't name it after someone who's alive or things like that, but there are literally thousands of other names that could come up that fit those parameters that may or may not be something the city's ready to say, hey, once you get 50%, we're going to rename your road Flower Blossom Lane or something, I don't know, whatever, right? So we might want to think about how that name is arrived at and how that would work in this order of process.
But did you see that at the bottom, it says the council gets to decide?
Well, that's
Yeah.
not
but
actually a rule I want to, have too much.
Well, we
but,
did it with the park.
Flower Blossom Lane it is, all right.
But
You're already coming
I
up
think
with good
the
ones.
point is well taken, though, that I think there needs to be a process thoughtfully to come up with a name that has some parameters associated with it, similar to our park naming process. So it's nice to have the criteria here, but I think we should, really what it is if residents want to change the name, they should be able to petition the city to start a process
Yeah,
to
yeah.
come up with a new name.
Yep.
And then outline kind of what that process is as part of the policy as well. So, good start, a little more work maybe, but I because once again, I think that there's more to naming a street than just having 50% plus one decide we want to
Yeah.
call it whatever it was, Flower Blossom or something. Yeah, I think we want to pursue the policy and just, tweak and add that aspect to it so that we can make sure that we have a good, and a key thing that we're all concerned about is engagement, and certainly, I think that's an area where the people who are going to live on the street are going to want to have a lot of say in what it's called, and maybe the right answer isn't necessarily 50% behind a name, maybe we want a little more than that, I don't know, but I mean, I think that conversation needs to have some more thought into it to just be sure. Councilmember Schroeder.
Well, I do like the idea, though, the people living on the street get
Yes.
to do it,
Right.
because you don't want everyone in the community weighing in on it. I think that would be. a
Your
little-
address changes from 1900 County Road B to 1900, I won't give up a name, to something else. That's a
Yeah, yeah.
real change in a lot of
Yes.
So I
their
think-
communication, their professional lives, or whatever, that's a big impact.
It's the people who are affected by it need
Yep.
to be the ones to be doing this. And
Yeah.
I think that's, and my point being, again, we need to have the policy, and you're right, I think it does need to be tweaked, but I think this is what we need to do to set up some parameters, some expectation for the public, I guess, starting the process.
Yeah. And it can be a different scale too. If for some reason we got the chance to rename County Road B all the way through Roseville, not that couldn't happen. I think under state statute, conceivably we could. That might be a little different engagement than, because now we got a lot of businesses involved, we got other things, so we may have to think a little bit about some of those not currently aware of situations that may come up that could be affected by this as well. So it's kind of the look more broadly at if we're putting in place a general policy for the whole city, how does it impact a number of scenarios or situations, just to be sure we're accounting for those in our policy.
Sure, you could put in there, like, if it affects more than a certain number of people, then it becomes a different process.
Something like that.
Yes,
yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
don't have to have the answer this evening, but at
Yeah.
least think about what that
Something
might look like.
that, yeah.
All right, have I forgotten anything from my fellow members? Any other discussion? I think we're good at this end, so any other discussion from council, anything else? you'd like
I did
us
want to
know?
provide just a little feedback on the draft from a while ago on the scope, duties, and functions. And it's not meant to be super critical, but there were some questions I had as I was reading it that I just wanted you to maybe think about how it might be clarified. And so I think it's primarily in the new E, which is engage with Roseville community. It says, while providing appropriate feedback, and I wanted to understand who was providing the feedback and to whom the feedback was being provided, because I wasn't 100% clear on that. And it could have been just because I was reading it right before I headed to my other meeting earlier today. And then the other one on F, collaborating with these other entities. And I wanted to understand what collaboration looked like or meant, because a lot of those entities, like for instance, the federal government is going to do whatever they want to, regardless of what you super commissioners say. And so once again, I think it was just more to clarify what it was trying to say there. So that's all I had. That's just a couple of points on that. And those may completely go away in your subsequent discussions here for a whole host of other reasons, but at least that's some feedback that I had on those two. Anything else from the council or the commission? All right. Great discussion, and it doesn't
Thank
have to be only once a year. We always encourage you, if there's things like a recycling contract discussion or some of these follow-ups on some of these items that it makes sense to come back. You're more than welcome to come back as a commission and have that conversation with the council.
All right, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate all your work.
That then brings us to, with a little bit of transition here, our next business item, and this is to consider a preliminary plat, a preliminary approval of a major plat of a parcel for 10 lots for single-family attached homes. And we've got our, never going to get the name, the title correct.
Senior planner.
Senior planner. That's right. I keep wanting to say associate planner, but I think that was about 10 years ago that you might have had that title, if ever. Senior planner Brian Lloyd with us this evening to bring this item forward and introduce it to the council for consideration. Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you. Excuse me. As you mentioned, this is an application for approval of a preliminary plat at 2560 Fry Street, essentially near Oakcrest Avenue and Snelling Avenue there. The proposal, as illustrated in here with all the lines, rather busy looking drawing, is to build 10 dwellings in 5 twin home structures along a little shared driveway in the middle with an outlot here for the stormwater management infiltration area, kind of a collection and infiltration area. The proposal meets all of the city's requirements in terms of lot size and area. The private driveway there, the shared driveway, is something that meets the minimum width standards because there is not space for an appropriate turnaround at the end of it for fire apparatus. The fire department has indicated they'll likely require sprinkling of particularly some of the easternmost units that are far enough away from Fry Street here to warrant the sprinkling. The proposal, being a subdivision, increasing the number of residential lots does qualify for park dedication. There's a figure for park dedication based on the Parks and Recreation Commission's review. I believe it was in early May. And the public hearing was held by the Planning Commission in early June. And there wasn't a lot of public feedback at that meeting. The predominant concern expressed by some Planning Commission members and kind of echoed by the person who was there to speak revolved around parking, particularly with the busy Rosebrook Park nearby. And there are times when games and such are programmed there that parking is a sort of a premium on the streets nearby there. But otherwise, aside from those concerns, the Planning Commission did vote 6-1. Is that the right number? There was maybe 5-1. There's 1 in opposition. And voted to recommend approval of the proposed subdivision with a couple of conditions related to park dedication and the public improvements involving stormwater management and utilities and that sort of thing. We have a draft approval resolution in the council packet tonight that expresses the recommendation to approve with those conditions. And with that sort of summarized presentation, I would conclude and see if the council has any questions that I can answer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lloyd. Are there questions from the council on this proposal this evening? Councilmember Grau.
I guess the main one would be the parking, and I'm sure you've looked at it. I know when door knocking in that area, there was a soccer game, and it does get all parked up along that street. So I understand the concern of the residents. Can you speak to that?
There isn't really a whole lot to say. The proposal does accommodate all of the required parking in the zoning code within the site. As a street, Fry Street, that has available on-street parking, that will be used by residents there, by visitors to the park, by new residents in the development on occasion. The parking shortage, if that's what it is in the park, is not really the responsibility of the developer to remedy. The developer's doing what they can by, again, accommodating all the required parking on site and, frankly, building fewer units than the math would suggest they could, partly in order to make sure they're not putting an imposition on their own potential residents by having to park elsewhere.
Thanks.
All right. Other questions from the council?
No.
All right. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to this proposal as well. So we'll open it up for public comment or questions at this time. And just to repeat the rules of the road for public comment, we do allow 3 minutes per speaker. We ask that the speaker begins their comments with their name and either their street or address for the record. Direct questions and comments to the council. If there's a follow-up that's needed on any questions that are asked, we'll provide that at the end of the comment period. And each speaker gets one opportunity to speak. So make sure you cover it, and you can say a lot in 3 minutes, but I will enforce the time limit as gently as I can as well. And I just want to check, Mr. Trudgeon, do we still have any online participants?
We just have one person
One?
online.
For any online participants who may wish to speak to this item, we want those folks to identify themselves by using the raise your hand feature in Zoom, and we can bring you into the meeting for your comments. Online participants do not have to turn on your camera for your comments, but you do have to turn on your microphone, so be prepared to do that. With that, we'll open it up for anyone who wishes to speak from the public on this proposal this evening. All right. And keep an eye out for raised hands.
Mayor, council members, John Kiselishin, 3083 Victoria Street. My only question is, where I looked at the plans in the book in the back of the room, where's the fence between the private property and Rosebrook Park? Is there a fence already there? I'm not seeing that in any of the designs, but what is separating private property from the public property? There's a swimming pool that's there, kids running around. We've got that drainage pond being proposed in what would be the upper right-hand corner of the property. I presume there's probably a fencing requirement depending upon the size of the ponding and stuff like that, but that's not the main point. We have kind of a problem in this city in some places where there's a blurring between the public property and the private property, and I'd like to see that get addressed up front, because I don't want to have a scenario where 5 years later there's a question raised and then the taxpayers have to cover the cost of a fence dividing that, when really that should be borne by the development. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to speak to this item at this time? Any hand raised online?
No hand raised.
All right. One more opportunity. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to speak to this? All right, we'll close the public comment at this time, and we'll follow up with the question, and that reminded me of a question I have too. To what extent is there already fencing along that southern edge of the park? And then I have also a question about parking at the park, so it may be appropriate for Parks and Rec Director Matt Johnson, if you want to come up and be prepared to speak to either or both of those, either what's existing as fencing or what might be required, and how we can address that at this time.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor and Council. What exists currently is we have a row of pine trees that are right on that property line at this point in the game. That was certainly part of the conversation of the Parks and Recreation Commission and a desire to preserve those to the extent that we're able to do so. I'm not aware of an ordinance that we have on a city side that would require a neighboring property to install a fence. Now, I certainly defer to Brian and others on this being a new development if it's different, but we have plenty of parkland where we obviously don't have fences on adjacent parcels as we, throughout the city. So that's the answer to that question.
Okay, all right, I appreciate that. And are the pine trees on the city side of the property?
They are, yep.
Okay,
Yep.
so they're our responsibility.
Correct.
Okay. And Mr. Lloyd, anything on requirements in our code as to fencing adjacent to parks and other public properties?
In a development like this, if it were next to a low-density development, single-family homes, for instance, there would be a fencing requirement, this being a kind of more intensive development type. There's some screening, some buffering, if you like, built into those requirements, but not residences adjacent to something more intensive like park or commercial land. So that we don't have a zoning requirement that fences be installed in that location.
Okay, all right, thank you. And I see council has questions too. I did want to ask too about the parking at Rosebrook Park. It seems, well, there may be two aspects to it. One is the adequacy of the southern parking lot for the park building and/or the waiting pool, and then the adequacy of the northern parking lot for use of the fields, and the fact that people may not drive all the way up there to park for a game that's in a field right out next to the street. So can you kind of talk about how parking has been working at that park?
Yeah.
Because certainly I'm not necessarily going to say parking is something we need to take into account as to whether we approve or disapprove this proposal, because I understand the we don't put the requirement on this developer to solve other parking issues. But since the question has come up, and I know I've heard from neighbors in that area also, and have my own parking issues at that park, I just wanted to at least initiate a little bit of conversation about, do we need to take another look at parking related to Rosebrook Park and how it all fits into our bigger picture there. So since we've got our Parks and Rec director, I thought I'd put you on the spot a little bit with regard to that.
Sure, thank you, Mayor. I think adequacy is to an extent in the eye of the beholder. The neighbors love that parcel. It's one of 5 full-size soccer fields we have in a community of 33,000 people. Those fields are well used. We have not increased programming at that site in the 10 years I've been here. That programming amount has been consistent. What has changed is that building was installed in 2015, but at the time there was an intentional thought that Fry Street was available for parking. We also have the waiting pool there, which is, again, well used, well beloved. We hear that from the neighbors there as well, which you really run into, and certainly we could take a fresh look at it, but what you really run into is when you add parking, you take away green space, and green space is limited here in our city. So on most days during daytime use, I would not characterize parking as problematic. I would characterize it as busy by all means. Certainly, as you mentioned, it may not be a lack of parking, it may be a convenience situation of if you're playing at that at the southernmost field, you park by the southernmost field, you don't go up and around. But that's my, I guess, anecdotal observation. Certainly, we understand that residents, do have concerns about the number of cars that come many nights. We also have more walk-up use than we've seen at that park, and that's a good thing from a Parks and Recreation perspective. So,
It may be something that we want to look at, helping people to understand where other parking options are, perhaps, especially for the southern field. Because definitely I can imagine it'd be tough to get an entire team parked on Fry Street along with everybody else that's there for whatever. So, I certainly don't want to necessarily just put more parking in for the sake of more parking, but if there's ways to make it work better, with what we have. The other piece of it is that I do understand there may be a perspective from some residents that would prefer no parking along that street, and because they can't see the park for all the cars that are in front of it, plus pedestrian safety and some of those other issues. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of give and take in terms of that issue. But I did want to at least broach the subject and see if nothing else, maybe we can help with some signage to help people understand where to park for use of soccer fields and things like that, if that can help, and if it's appropriate, to look at things again down the road and see if we need to make any adjustments.
we can certainly look at that. Thank you, Mayor.
Just want to keep it on the radar. I don't know if other council members had questions or thoughts in regard to that while we've got staff here this evening, but that was all I had. All right. Thank you again.
I didn't want to enter in the parking discussion
Oh.
because that is separate from the
Yeah.
item before us here. But am I correct that the wading pool has a fence around it? Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again. And thanks to the public for the comments, and certainly through the process with the Planning Commission hearing and the meetings prior to that. We've got the request before us, including a draft resolution for consideration. And I would just say, as is typical with these types of applications, generally speaking, if something meets our code requirements, it's more challenging for a council to deny a request. We have to have findings of fact and state those clearly, and those can be challenged by developers. The other option that sometimes council has is if we feel that our standards aren't working in a particular instance, we could certainly table action and set in motion efforts to adjust our standards. We certainly have done that before, but just for the benefit of the public, sometimes during these processes it may seem like there's nothing that can be done, but I do want to note to the public that we do and have taken those opportunities when proposals come forward. And it doesn't, it meets our standards, but it doesn't seem like our standards are working properly. We have paused projects and gone through and updated our standards. And so that is something that can be done, but I will open it up to the council for a motion this evening. Councilmember Etten.
Move approval of the preliminary plat as per the RCA, including the homeowners association for maintenance of different portions of the parcel and the park dedication fee of $38,250.
I'd second it.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Etten, seconded by Councilmember Schroeder to approve the request for the major plat as outlined in the resolution. And as we've got a motion before us, the maker of the motion, Councilmember Etten, speaking to the motion.
Thank you. We've rezoned this property several years ago, really with the intention of encouraging this type of development, looking for a very needed form of housing, that medium-density housing. And I think this is a great proposal. I appreciate that what could have been 2 more lots has been left for that water retention pond, or BMP. I'm sorry. But I think this is also an excellent step down. We've got high density next to it, between that and the single-family homes, and we've got a bingo hall on the south side and parking lot. So I think this is a really good use for this space and a highly in-demand housing form for our city. Also, I think it's a much lower impact than the press gym that was there for years. Far fewer cars and other impacts, so.
All right. As the seconder of the motion, Councilmember Schroeder.
I second it. I just wanted to point out that actually, because of the garages and driveways, the parking for these units, I think there's plenty of room that will be for them to park. So I don't think you're going to see additional pressure on around them as much on the parking situation. So I don't think that's going to be a problem. And with 10, additional traffic, there'll be a little, but I don't think it's going to be that hard. Considering that this park is so busy, I don't think you're really going to notice a uptick in traffic as much. But again, I wanted to point out that the parking that they have incorporated into this development is, I think, going to cover a lot of some issues on the parking side of that, so.
Other discussion on the motion? Councilmember Groff?
It's the type of housing, as Councilmember Etten said, that is in demand, and I think it's a good addition to this area.
Right. And I would just add, echoing some of the other comments by council members, there continues to be a concern in the neighborhood about access in and out of the neighborhood. Ever since the state closed down the more robust access at Snelling. And so I think we want to continue looking at and perhaps working with our partners about the access on the Fairview side, and how that looks going forward. I know residents have asked for traffic lights or something in that area, and I know it's a challenging intersection because it's an offset of Oakcrest. But I think we need to keep it on our radar screen and continue those conversations. So taking this opportunity, because this is a proposal in that neighborhood, to just note that again, we want to keep that on our radar. With that, we've got the motion before us to adopt the resolution approving the preliminary major plat as outlined with the conditions as noted. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 4-0, and that is approved. Thank you again to staff and to the developer for bringing this forward, and we look forward to the next steps in the process. That brings us then to our third business item this evening, which is an opportunity to review and discuss pending future agenda items, and I'll turn it over to City Manager Trudgeon to introduce this item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mike, if I could have the computer screen. As you know, for a while, we have had a back page to our future agenda report about future items that are coming up that have not been scheduled, and over time it kind of accumulates into a long list. And so one of the ideas, and just going through the recent reformatting of some of these items, I just want to come back and visit with the council some items that have been on for a while that don't have any direct date where we're going to be taking it up, and just to have the conversation about the future of those and maybe schedule them if they're still of an interest. So we're not looking to necessarily get into a deep dive on these issues. It's more about, do we still want to talk about them, and if so, what's the relative time frame on that? And I've really highlighted the first, I think it's 5 of them, that we don't have any direct dates in mind here at this point, really. And the other ones, and we can certainly talk about the other ones as you would like. And some of them, you can see the first two after the yellow, zero waste packaging, compostable containers, and city speed limit review we just did tonight. So, and there's other things that will come up as we progress throughout the year. But I just wanted to tee that up for conversation, and I don't know if you want to go one by one and see where the council's at, and then we can take notes and do the appropriate follow-up, or take it off the list if it's no longer relevant. So that's the extent I have of a presentation.
All right, the first item is a item initiated by Councilman Ratten related to inspections of single-family rentals, et cetera, and I'll turn it over to Councilman Ratten for maybe his thoughts on where he's at on that one right now.
Yeah, thank you. I had an opportunity to have conversations with some staff about this, and I think for me, I would pull this off of our consideration at this time because of how much additional staff time it would take. Adding potentially a couple of new staff members to do it would require a large increase in fees to cover it, or tax dollars to cover it. I think there are some purposes there, but I'm not sure whether it takes significant time away. I would say in that conversation, one of the things we clarified was that we do send out something for posting in these rentals, kind of the renters' responsibilities, some of their rights, and that I asked that we consider even including a QR code with some of our primary other than English languages in our city, so that folks can have better access to that information if they need that, instead of it only being in English. Certainly heard about recently a place that could benefit from that communication, putting up something in English sounds great, but the communication piece is missing, and this isn't ideal, but it's better than what else happens. And I think we should be continuing that type of thinking with all of our communication as we're working even with a code problem that's exterior, whether it's single family or owner-owned or rental property, that we are looking at how do we ensure that we are communicating in a way that works for those residents so they understand whether it's in person with an interpreter or signage or QR codes that take people to information that's easier, even things that are read in a different language, a QR code that goes to something where it reads through those, understanding that not all written language is used by some of our immigrant populations. So thinking about that more broadly and how we can be adapting to the folks we're serving.
I think that's a very good point, and it brings to mind, for instance, the postings that are required in our recent updates to the massage therapy ordinance.
Yeah.
Access to those in other languages would be very helpful for a lot of folks who are potentially working in those establishments who don't have English as their first language. Good point. So it sounds like that item, unless anybody else on the council wants to take up the flag for that, that Councilmember Brad is setting down. But it is worth noting, too, that we should continue to pay attention to issues related to health and safety.
Yep.
And if we see changes, certainly I think staff has been very good about bringing proposals to us about changing our programs or our systems, and we just want to make sure that we're not losing sight of that important function that we have, but it doesn't sound like we need to institute a program of inspections at this time. All right, next is the pet licensing. We don't actually have the initiator of this conversation on the council anymore, which may impact our conversation on it, but I see Councilmember Schroeder has
I actually called him
Oh,
to talk to him about that because I was very curious about this. I did talk to Bob, and what he did say was the reason he brought this up was and he did talk to the police chief about it as well. It's not being enforced, and they the whole thought was, do we really need to have it? Because at this point, what is the need? And before he thought it was to be able to get pets with their owners, but most pets are chipped now and all that. And so his thought was, why even bother to have it if we don't enforce it? And actually, tell you the truth, I don't think most people know about that you need to have a license. And so his thought was, just eliminate it, was his thought on it. So that seemed like a fairly straightforward conversation to say to staff. Do you think it makes sense just to get rid of it so it's one less thing for staff to deal with?
and just to update folks who may or may not remember that conversation at the time, the system was put in place where it's like $5 to get a license if your pet is spayed or neutered and microchipped, and then the prices for the licenses are significantly higher if they don't have that. The notion being to incentivize people to do the microchip and the spay and the neuter, to help control the pet population, as Bob Barker used to say, as well as to help connect lost pets with their owners. I think the microchipping thing is happening much more frequently than it was at that time, just by the nature of the people's comfort with technology, people's desire to keep track of their pet or recover a lost pet. So I'm not sure that requirement is necessarily as necessary as it was. I'm not sure about the aspect of having the pets spayed and neutered, and the notion of dealing with, overpopulation of feral animals and things like that. I think that's still out there as an issue. Certainly, we see a lot of reports of lost pets on various social media around the community. So I don't know. It might be worth asking about, do we need to make a change? But I'm not sure the council's spending a lot of time and energy on the conversation. We may have spent too much time on it this evening already.
And the budget implications of
The
that
budget
$5
implication, yeah. Well, yeah, certainly it wasn't a financial boon for the city, but at the same time, yeah, I mean,
I think it came down to more is maybe just ask staff if they think it's a good thing to have or not, and then have them say to council, yeah, we think so or no,
Right.
and leave it at that,
that might be a good way to approach it.
because they're the ones who have to deal with it.
Exactly.
Well, because right now, if somebody comes to the city for a pet license.
We issue it.
Who issues the license? Who's responsible for that step?
Um,
Is that, or it's happened so seldom, probably we don't.
Yeah, no, I know it used to be the front receptionist was able to do that, but the front receptionist,
Front
okay,
receptionist?
that's
Okay.
correct.
So people have to provide the documentation
Right,
of the
right.
two things if they
Right.
want the lower price.
Right.
Otherwise, they just pay the fee and get their
Right.
their
So-
tag
so-
or whatever.
So people do it,
Yeah.
but there's probably a large swath of the population that don't. To what numbers? We could look at the historical numbers of licenses we grant a year and see what that trend is telling us.
And we don't enforce it.
No, not really.
I think that we look at the historical trend, get a recommendation from staff, but rules on the book that don't go anywhere
No.
are, it's not hard to get rid of,
Right.
right?
Well, and like I said, if the purpose of the regulation is being accomplished and the regulation still isn't being followed, that's kind of an indication that we may not need it anymore, so.
Yeah.
Right. Sister-city relationship. So this was initiated by Councilmember Strawn. She didn't necessarily have a lot to say in an email to me about various topics tonight that I've been kind of referring to and talking from earlier. On this one, she noted it's a good way to foster relationships, although she wouldn't consider looking into it until we had a new diversity and inclusion equity manager. So I'm not sure how that fits into what the rest of the council thinks about looking at this. Certainly open for council feedback. We could just put it off. We could put it at the end of the list for a while until
Put it at the end of the
yeah,
list for a while.
we can revisit it. Councilmember Bratton?
We can put it down the list if we want to. I'm not sure what we're gaining here, what connections tribes would feel to Roseville, per se. We're talking about this is historically land of the Dakota, and I don't know, reaching out to a tribe that's probably now in South Dakota or other places like that, and saying, hey, do you want to have it? I don't see what we're doing.
Well, I would ask the tribe before I make that assumption,
Fair.
Ask Native Americans. I mean, we have a bunch of white people over here.
Why don't we move it down on the list, and perhaps Councilmember Strong can think
Yep.
about timing as to bring this back to the council. We can since we do take up this on a meeting by meeting basis now, we can have an opportunity to move that forward, because I think we don't want to have the discussion this evening to the extent we're not completely informed about it. And I've got personal opinions about sister-city relationships in general, so I won't
Yeah,
get into those this evening,
well,
those
that's
types
a
of
good
things.
discussion.
Yes, exactly,
That's much
exactly,
needed.
yep. Okay. Rooster regulations. This one didn't have a specific council member associated with that. I think it came forward as part of
That's not
a
yours.
council discussion about another issue, and a resident had, I think, raised it. Was that what it
Yes.
was?
Right.
And we, coincidentally enough, at our manager-administrator meeting this afternoon, or mayor-administrator meeting, other communities were asking about who has regulations on chickens and And we didn't speak too much because we allow them, but we don't really have any specific regulations.
We allow for chickens, we more regulate where the chicken coop is, it needs to meet the
So it's more
setbacks.
code requirements.
And traditionally, what we find is a lot of people are interested and they start looking into it. This is costly and they may not, or they may do it for a while and say, boy, this is a lot of work. So we don't have a huge number as far as we know, and we don't get many complaints. I know in this particular instance, there was a rooster in the neighborhood. Offhand, I would have to probably do some more research on exactly how we address roosters. Some cities don't allow roosters, just chickens.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything in our code
Yeah.
specifically.
So if anything, maybe there is a specific requirement that you cannot have roosters, and then that's something we could then enforce if there's a nuisance going on. And this was last year. I've not heard any other follow-up. If it is continuing as being a problem, if it's isolated just in that neighborhood, or we have this big problem throughout the city. I haven't heard that we had, but.
I haven't heard it as a big problem, but I do know the person who does have the problem, it is a big problem because
Right.
his wife is
Continuing
home.
to go on.
And he's a full-time day caregiver, and so she needs certain amounts of rest during the day, and that rooster will keep.
And it's continuing as an issue.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
It probably makes sense to kind of put this into a conversation about any updates to our nuisance code
Yeah.
in general.
It is a nuisance
Yeah,
issue, really.
Yeah,
You get
and then, so we can kind of have maybe multiple topics. If there's other things in our nuisance code we need to be looking at, this would be a good one to put
Sure.
with that.
Certainly. Okay. Got that?
And then the off-sale liquor license, this is once again Councilor Ratton item.
That's me. I was looking at the difference in penalties for on-sale versus off-sale, and there are purposes. If you take a liquor store out of business for a day, that's their only business. Maybe they have now some edibles or whatever, but essentially you're taking them out of business for a day, and I understand that that is a much greater penalty than if you're asking a restaurant to now sell wine and beer for a day. So I wouldn't be looking at a suspension, but rather a higher financial penalty to kind of bridge the gap between those things, to make sure that our establishments understand the seriousness of this. Because what we look at is we have the same financial penalty on sale, off sale, but on sale also has a suspension option hanging over their head. So they have a much bigger penalty because they are on sale instead of off sale. And I thought we could make those penalties feel to the business more equally.
So looking at, because we don't have the suspension for the off-sale.
Right.
Looking at upping the fine for the off-sale.
Yes.
correspondingly.
First violation.
Trying
I think
to
we could-
equalize the financial impact
We could-
and making it so that it feels a serious violation.
I think we do have a limit in state law of $2,000. So if we're already there, we can't go up any farther.
Sure.
We may have to figure out if there's something else we can do, or maybe we do.
Well, we don't need to break state law. That's,
No, we definitely shouldn't do that.
How about federal?
Generally speaking, yes.
thank you for that insight.
Softball question for this evening, yes. Can we break the law? And maybe there's just a way to address it in another way. And I'd be willing to have some conversation about that, but I think somebody's going to have to do some research as to what
Sure.
that is. And we could always designate a council member to spend some more time thinking about that. Bring back a
Designate
proposal.
Councilmember Schroeder,
Sure is being done.
former Finance Commission Chair.
I don't know, do I get to sample stuff when I do this?
Maybe we don't want this conversation
No.
any farther.
It's being taken.
City Manager.
Mr. City Manager.
So right now, currently, the off-sale first violation is a $1,000 fine, no suspension.
Okay.
Second violation is $2,000, and beyond that's $2,000. So
Are there any suspensions for off-sale?
yes, the second violation within 36 months is 3-day suspension, and third violation in 36 months is 7-day suspension and
For
$2,000.
off-sale.
For off-sale,
So
yes.
conceivably, we could just max out the financial for the first violation,
Yeah.
and then we're done.
That's an easy fix.
All right. So moved. No, wait. An ordinance, we have to publish it first.
So I'm hearing maybe consensus to bring that back
Bring
for
that back.
consideration at
Yeah.
a future meeting?
I think so.
I think that's
That makes
reasonable.
sense.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
great.
Any of the other ones on the list that any council members want to weigh in on at this time? Otherwise, the list will stay
Is this
in.
weighing in to see if we want to get rid of something? Is that?
If you want to, yeah.
Okay.
But we do have this on the agenda each time
Yep.
too, so if
Yep.
we don't have anything we're prepared to speak to this evening, we can do that at another time as well. It was primarily, as Mr. Trudgeon said, these top items here. I think hearing nothing else from the council on this, then we'll move on with our agenda. And thanks again for that, and thanks to Mr. Trudgeon for bringing this forward, and hopefully on a periodic basis, we'll be able to stay on top of these things. Next on our agenda is consideration of city council meeting minutes. We have the minutes from our June 20th, 2023 council meeting. And I know I taxed our staff with a lot of changes on those this time around, but any other noted changes or corrections from a council perspective?
I think it's well covered.
All right, or corrections of my corrections. If there are no changes or corrections, a motion to approve as presented would be in order.
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder, seconded by Councilmember Groff, to approve the minutes of our June 20th council meeting as presented. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 4-0. Those items, or excuse me, those minutes are approved. That brings us to the consent agenda. I'll turn it over to Mr. Trudgeon. No items were removed, so we have a complete consent agenda at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, item 10A approves payments in the amount of $2,404,314.81. Item 10B approves several expenditures, including maintenance on the Willow Pound Outlet, annual road salt purchase, the ordering of trucks for delivery in 2024, and equipment for one of the new trucks. Item 10C approves a resolution awarding the contract for the 2023 drainage improvement project to bituminous roadways in the amount of $486,308.50. Item 10D approves a resolution requesting the conveyance of a tax forfeit parcel known as Farrington Estates Outlot A for stormwater purposes from Ramsey County. Item 10E approves an ordinance amending the zoning code regarding the definitions and table of allowed uses for an environmental service center, and adopts a resolution approving a conditional use for Ramsey County to construct an environmental service center at 1725 Kent Street. The Planning Commission approved this request, or both requests, on a 6-0 vote at a previous Planning Commission meeting. Item 10F approves the renewal of a short-term rental license for 1885 Shady Beach Avenue. 10G approves the renewal of a short-term rental license for 257 South McCarran's Boulevard. And agenda item 10H approves entering into a project agreement with Roseville Apartment Redevelopment to construct a 6-foot sidewalk as part of their development at 1415 County Road B, which is right across from Harmar Mall. The cost of the sidewalk will be borne for the developer, and that is the consent agenda.
All right, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon. Is there a motion on the consent items?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Groff, second by Councilmember Ratten. Discussion? I just wanted to note one thing on the item related to the Environmental Service Center for the county. I did have a question for staff earlier today about the definition not specifically excluding doing anything other than collection of those household hazardous waste items and things like that. I was a little bit concerned that conceivably on the site, somebody could interpret that to mean that they could start processing recyclables or, something along those lines. And I got assurance from staff that they didn't feel that we needed to update the definition because it does only mention collection. But I'd at least wanted it on the radar sort of officially that question is out there, and that certainly if in at least staff's and my opinion, if the county wanted to do more than just collection of those items at that site, they would have to then come back to the city for approval of that. So I just wanted to note that for the record. And with that, if there's no other comments, we do have the consent agenda items for us for approval. No other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 4-0. Next is future agenda review and various other communications, reports, announcements, and we'll start with the future agenda review. Mr. Trudgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So our next meeting is next Monday, the 17th. We'll start off the evening with the EDA meeting. We'll look at the preliminary 2024 EDA budget and also receive an updated status of TIF districts, kind of where they are currently at. Then as part of our work session in our city council meeting, we'll have a presentation on the capital improvement plan. We'll also receive a presentation by Tubman regarding financial partnership with the city of Roseville. They've approached the city, and not just the city of Roseville, other cities in Ramsey County, regarding some financial assistance. We've had a long partnership with Tubman, with our police department to provide services over the years. They are struggling a little bit. It probably leads to a lot of bigger conversations as well, but they'll provide the information to us at the next meeting. And then also the SAC credit policy discussion. That's something we teed up previously, but something to have a more formal discussion on that.
That's sewer access charge.
Yeah, sewer access, I'm sorry, yes, charge. And then on the 24th, we have the Kiwanis Peanut Day proclamation. We also have the Prince of Peace interim use request. Would note that did get recommended by the Planning Commission last Wednesday on like 5-1 vote, if I recall. We have a preliminary plat for Schreier Avenue. We also want to have a cannabis law update. There's a lot of information out there. Our city attorney will lead us through that. This is just more information sharing, and we can talk about next steps here. There's a lot of steps along the way. There's appears to be some time to get there, but we want to at least lay the groundwork for everybody. And certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to bring them up. Then also, we'll receive a grant application update as part of our normal course of business. So that's all we have scheduled for right now.
Right. Questions from the council or council-member initiated items for future meetings or reports or announcements? Any or all? Councilmember Schroeder.
Just a report. I did attend the League of Minnesota Cities Conference up in Duluth, and that was a great event. There are a lot of changes coming our way, and our city manager has mentioned a number of them, especially cannabis and a few other things. So the getting together with the other cities, hearing what they're doing, it was very informational. But the highlight of it, which I just wanted to emphasize, and I know it's in our city news, is we, as a city, Roseville, got a sustainability award. Out of all the cities in Minnesota, our city got that award, and I just wanted to say congratulations to all the people that worked on it, and it was a great thing to be there to see that happen, and it was a good event. And of course, Mr. Mayor, you could probably say a few more words about the award, because you've been part of that whole process from the beginning.
True enough. Now I'll have to think about what I'll say. Well, it was specifically it was an award for our Partners in Energy program, and the effort we had there, where we put together sort of our energy action plan, and tying in with Excel programs as well as some other things that we're doing, especially to get businesses connected with the things they can do, and so that whole aspect of it was what we were awarded for, and as well as some of our programs to connect people with opportunities to be more sustainable. So it was great, and once again, great staff effort. Everybody in the organization contributed to that, and it was nice to be recognized for that. If I may, I do have a couple of announcements. One is that we just heard today, I saw a thing from staff about we got awarded a grant for the pathway on Hamlin north of C. And that is currently scheduled for 2025, but I understand that staff is going to attempt to swap the timing of that with our approved Lexington pathway project for 2024, and that's tied to specifically that pedestrian incident that happened in that location a couple months ago, which kind of intensified the focus on the need for the pathway there. So to the extent that can happen, that would be great, but regardless, if we can't move it ahead, certainly it's on the schedule for 2025, so that's good news. Anything else from council members from the point of view of announcements or communications?
One announcement, Roseville at 75, because it's the anniversary this year, and we're going to be celebrating in the park on July 22nd. I will be from noon until about 4 or 5 o'clock.
So I think it's 2 o'clock on the 22nd
2 o'clock
in Central Park.
Yeah, and there's some other things going on at noon, so
Gotcha.
come and go as you want.
Yeah.
There'll
in the
be
park.
some things from the city there, and there'll be some cake, and there'll be some storytelling, and some music, and a women's drum group, and so it'll be fun.
A lot of fun. And the thing that's before that is Envision Roseville, an opportunity for the families to engage with us about some of our plans for the future in the community, and our vision for the next, whatever it is, 20 years, 10 years in the community. So a great tie-in with that. But it's good to have a celebration and appreciate Arts Roseville involvement in the planning and putting that together. I've been having a little bit of an opportunity to interact with some of the folks planning it for a small role that I get to have.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to
You will be greeting
party.
us.
Yes. Mr. Trudgeon.
Thank you, Councilmember Schroeder, for bringing up the award, and thank you for being there, and the mayor as well. We're real proud of it, but it's certainly a team effort from the council to the staff and doing that. I was going to mention, though, that the league is planning on coming, I think it's August 10th meeting, 21st meeting, to actually present it to us.
Oh, good.
So we'll have a little bit more conversation about that, but they'll formally present it to the council at that meeting, so that'll be nice to see.
Great.
Nice.
All right. Very good. Is there anything else from the council this evening? If not, the only thing left on our agenda is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder to adjourn, seconded by Councilmember Etten. No discussion on a motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. We are adjourned at 7:59 p.m. Thank you, everyone.
We're very close to a